Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to today's Distinguished University Lecture by Professor Llew Gibbons. Before he speaks, we will be introducing him, telling you all sorts of great things about him, and formally installing him as a Distinguished University Professor. To get that started, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Ayers, who's our Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. Bill.
Thanks, Ben. I was telling Ben beforehand, I love introducing cool people because it's an opportunity to embarrass them in a good cause. I want to thank Ben and thank the law school for their willingness to host this event today and also for your support for your tremendous faculty here in the College of Law. As many of you are probably aware, the Distinguished University Professor Award is the highest honor that the University of Toledo can bestow on its faculty. It is granted only to a chosen few, maybe 3 or so every year, who have earned national and often international recognition for their outstanding educational and scholarly contributions in their fields. It is indeed a rare and treasured honor and a reminder that we have faculty here at the University of Toledo who can stand shoulder to shoulder with the best in the world. So what has Professor Gibbons done to earn such high esteem? If you ask him, he will undoubtedly demur, modesty being one of his chief characteristics, which of course is why we don't ask speakers to introduce themselves. In his place, let me take a stab at answering the question. Professor Gibbons has a long and distinguished career dating back to his days as a faculty member at Temple University School of Law and the University of Orlando before he came here to join us at UT. He also served as a law clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which, I don't have to tell this crowd, is arguably the most influential of the federal appellate courts and certainly center to some of the most important decisions of the last several decades. But it is not just longevity that earns the title of Distinguished University Professor, it is impact. By any measure, Professor Gibbons has had a tremendous impact on the field of law and on generations of law students well beyond his length of service. His list of publications is far too long to recount here, covering a wide range of topics within the increasingly important field of trademark and intellectual property law. Several of his articles have been cited by federal or state courts, demonstrating impact not just on the next generation of legal scholarship, but on the law itself. His scholarship coincides with the invention and explosion of the Internet, which has upended the realm of intellectual property, and his work has helped contribute to the evolution of thought and of law in this tumultuous era. I was interested to discover he has been a panelist for an organization called eResolution, one of the original 4 Internet domain name dispute resolution services recognized by ICANN. ICANN being the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the closest thing the Internet has to a governing body. Talk about being present at the creation. Looking back, historians will mark this as a seminal period in the development of intellectual property, and Professor Gibbons has been a major player in shaping this era. His work has been widely recognized in the United States and around the world, both for his scholarly contributions as well as his work in legal education. He is an elected member of the American Law Institute and a fellow of the American Bar Foundation. He has served the American Association of Law Schools in several capacities. If I were to list them here, it would be too long. And is a past president of the Central States Association of Law Schools. He has taught and presented internationally in China, Argentina, Italy, Finland, Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary. It's more impressive than my list of travels. Currently, he holds the title, as I think is on the screen behind me somewhere, of Llewellyn Scholar Chair of Law at Zhongnan University of Economics and Law in Wuhan, China. And he has held fellowships with the Salzburg Seminar, the Abraham L. Friedman Program at Temple University, and the Center for the Study of Intellectual Property Rights in China. But beyond these many international scholarly and international accolades, perhaps the most important measure for any university professor is the impact we have on our students. In nominating Professor Gibbons for the Distinguished University Professorship, Dean Barros noted that his student evaluations are filled with comments about how his courses are challenging and intellectually stimulating. High praise from any group of students, and I suspect especially from law students. One of his students went so far as to circulate a petition in support of granting him an award for his teaching, an effort that garnered more than 100 signatures. He is the kind of professor that students will remember long into their professional careers, ensuring that his impact will continue for decades to come. We are indeed fortunate to have such a leading light on our faculty and delighted to have him here today to give us some insight into one of the leading internet questions of our time, the issue of net neutrality. I'd like to ask Dean Barros to return to the podium for the official installation.
On behalf of the Academic Honors Committee at the University of Toledo, I officially install Llewellyn J. Gibbons as a Distinguished University Professor. Congratulations. Thank you.
Just one little thing. Turn the mic. I have to say one thing. You'll note that nobody who made any of these statements was under oath. Please remember that. The second thing is, when I heard the introduction, there's a Chinese phrase called nali nali, where. When someone says something nice to you, say where, because they clearly are not talking about me. They must be talking about someone else. And that's the way I felt with the introduction. I would like to thank Dean Barros, Dr. Ayers, Dr. Barlow for the very generous introductions. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank members of the community who have supported me off and on over the years, and who I've had the pleasure to interact with for attending. Those of you who know me, have seen me teach, I am not used to reading. I'm not used to standing at a podium. Unfortunately, time constraints are sort of forcing me to change my teaching habits. I apologize in advance that in order to comply with the strict time limits, I had to delete the humor, sarcasm, wit, and whimsy from this presentation. Unfortunately, all that's left is tired and tedious. But I hope for some it'll be a bit new or novel. Today I'll introduce two intertwined questions. Who will be the internet haves and have-nots? And what will the limits of a non-net neutrality policy place on the haves or have-nots? All this information is important to us. I'd like to think about the internet as a place of metaphor. A place, you can think of it as a physical location. And every time we build a barrier to access, by access it can be no access at all to the web, or access that slows things down. Most of us have the experience that when something slows down, even for a moment, we lose interest in the web. But policies like a non-net neutrality policy have a side effect, and a major side effect. They are like putting the railroad tracks to a small town or a city. For those of you who live in Northwest Ohio, and as a New Yorker I did not appreciate it, railroad tracks are sufficiently barriers, are scary barriers. For the times when I get to the railroad track and I start counting at the 100th car, and I have to keep counting. They make life slow and inconvenient. So we have an internet now, a information superhighway, in which everyone who gets on, once they're on it, accesses it at the same speed. Your on-ramp or your off-ramp, what you pay for with your ISP may be higher or lower, more or less, but once you're on the web, everything travels at the same speed. Non-discrimination policy. What will net neutrality mean? A non-net neutrality policy mean? It means we're putting up a toll road. We're putting up a toll road in which some things will go, or a fast lane, however you want to describe it, some things will go slower, some things will go faster. But that's the first generation. The services like I'll talk about hopefully in this presentation if I have time, deep packet inspections. We can identify content on the web. Think of this as not we're going from a toll road to a customs inspection point. Think of delays for those who've been to Canada, any foreign country, entering or leaving the United States, that when you have to inspect for customs, the content, we're going to slow things down further. And once you inspect for content, you get to decide what comes in and what goes out. This is the fun part. Now, there are many definitions of net neutrality. There are many arguments. They are being debated in Congress in front of the Federal Communications Commission. I'm indifferent. I don't care for the purpose of this presentation. For the purposes of this presentation, net neutrality is a non-discrimination clause. ISPs, internet service providers, broadband providers, content providers will not discriminate based on the quantity or quality of the data going over the pipes. Again, I'm not focusing on the last half mile. Last mile, as they say, the part that goes in and out of your house. I'm focusing on how things, once you get on the highway itself, how things are flowing. Again, this term, rhetorically and politically, has many different meanings over the year, and I'm trying to eschew all of them. Now, what's the definition? Generally not much, unless you're a lawyer. Well, we're fighting over here what is an internet service provider? What is an online service provider? In many regulations and many statutes, these terms are used differently. But in essence, an ISP is a company that provides its customers with access to the internet, and they also provide other internet-related services, such as email accounts. We're focusing on access to the web. Now, what's in front of the FTC, I keep saying FTC, I mean FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is whether or not an ISP is a common carrier, like the telephone company. Remember the good old days of Ma Bell? For those of us who remember the Reagan administration and pre-Reagan administration, we had a huge telecom carrier. Or an internet service provider, something that was added in 1996 to deal with the fact the FCC, while it has heavy hands of regulation on common carriers, because when you deal with multi-billion-dollar, multi-state entities, they need heavy regulation, at least in theory. Internet service providers, that is the mom-and-pop company that buys bandwidth and resells it to you to provide local access. Clearly, the AT&Ts of the world, the Pac Bells, the Ameritex can deal with the FCC on a level playing field and fight them tooth and nail legally. The mom-and-pop ISPs needed a gentle hand of regulation so they could begin and thrive in the early days of the internet. Now, the FCC started with some open internet principles. You, the consumer, the content user, should have access to all lawful internet of your choice. My ISP should not choose what I can see and when I can see it. If you wanted to decide what you can see and when you can see it, you can buy Net Nanny, CyberCity. There's a dozen computer programs that allow you to control what you and your family see, but that decision was to be made by you and your family, the consumer, not by your internet service provider. You should be allowed to run the software of your choice, the application, and to use these services on the web. Again, it was not unlimited. There were limitations. You cannot use devices that would cause harm to the network. That's sort of common sense. And you should have a right to choose your network provider, application and service providers, and content providers of your choice. These things should not necessarily be bundled. I should have a right to get an unbundled package of web services, an unbundled package of access, an unbundled package of content. Well, the first set of rules I told you were wish list. These were the 4 principles, which I just spoke about, that weren't binding. In 2010, the FCC issued the Preserving the Internet Order, creating 2 classes of internet service providers for access, fixed line providers, and for wireless net. Fixed line providers are people like your telephone company that basically from point A to point B are running wire or fiber optic or something else. Wireless net, Again, think of it as your phone, think of it as Wi-Fi. And they had 3 rules: transparency, no blocking, no unreasonable discrimination. Transparency: the consumer had rights to know what was going on. What are the policies, rules, and regulations that will govern the consumer's behavior in cyberspace or the use of the service? No blocking: you can't block sites. I, the ISP, cannot say, it's my pipe, I will not let you communicate with people I don't like. And discrimination could not have unreasonable discrimination. These 3 principles in 2010, again, basically they're ratifying a policy that began in 2005, are the core values of net neutrality. Well, nobody's always happy with anything. 2014, the DC Circuit vacated part of the FCC's open internet order. It liked the transparency provision, it was not happy with the blocking provision, and it wasn't happy with the access provision. And the DC Circuit did not say, FCC, you cannot do this. You simply used the wrong statutory authority. You should have used your powers, the broad draconian powers you have, to regulate telecommunications and common carriers, and not the softer, gentler hand Congress gave you for internet service providers. The FCC took the advice and went back and reconsidered and recrafted net neutrality policies. I'll come back to a moment. What's the controversy? I'm told I have to be a little philosophical, so I went back. It's the nature of the net. Now, people like me think of Rousseau. You know, people are basically good. People use the web in a wise and just way, most of the time for most reasons. And because of that, we need minimal or no regulations, and currently the soft hand of government to gently nudge a person in the right direction. Others look at the web as man against man, war against all. Life is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And my life in the web is poor, nasty, brutish, and short every time I read the comments to anyone's postings on the web. It is amazing how you can get from a cookie recipe to you must be a Nazi. Now, this is my first law review article on the web in 1997. My articles always used to start with cartoons, and I stopped the custom because of a dean at the University of Toledo. He decided they're unprofessional and inappropriate for law review articles. I could deal with that. All my deans know how much I love and respect, and their wish is my command. However, he said he refused to pay for them. That command I heeded to. But I like this cartoon because this was showing the internet was in cyberspace, or cyberspace was breaking into the popular culture, and we were trying to figure out a way to run the web. And I and other scholars at the beginning looked at this, and we suggested no regulation at all whenever possible. If self-regulation should be through contract, should be technology. We decided small c code, there's a capital C code, like the United States code generally should be rejected in favor of code, as in software code, the building blocks of the web, or code, or contracts, or social pressure, social norms. There's lots of ways to affect behavior. And last but not the least, unlike Hobbes, who suggested and justified the absolute government, because absent absolute government, the one property I have, my life, can be taken. Back then in cyberspace, you had a life outside of cyberspace. Many of you do not have lives outside of social media. But back then you did. So if I was unhappy, I was dissatisfied, I could declare myself a refugee and flee cyberspace and find a place of safe harbor. I hate to say that, that is no longer true. Many of us find, whether we like it or not, we're suckers spending part of our times and part of our lives in cyberspace for reasons of employment or reasons. Again, one of the assumptions of this article, we debated content providers. We debated bulletin board services. We debated all kinds of things. E-commerce, buying and selling on the web, moderating and mediating human behavior, adjudicating disputes. All these things were debated. The one thing we all assumed, all the scholars, the academics, and the practitioners I met at conferences, symposiums, and CLE, was that the road would be neutral. Access to the web, leaving the web, the on and the off ramp will be neutral. Again, we expected you to pay more for higher bandwidth. My first modem was 300 baud. I went to 1200. Every time I went up, I had to pay more for my access. I expected that. But once I put my message on the web, my message has just as much right to speed across the web as something from Bill Gates, something from Microsoft. Once we had access to the web, my message would go along with just as fast, as Bill Gates. Now, during these lectures, the dupe is supposed to confess to failure. And as I was introduced, I was present at the beginning. I was very lucky, present at the beginning of the web. Most of us would jump with joy to realize we were present at the beginning of our discipline. But in this article you're seeing in 1997, the first line starts, quote, Siberians are present at the creation of the jurisdiction of cyberspace and the closing of the electronic frontier. I said that in 1997. 20 years later, I'm coming back to say the same thing. The frontier was closed one way. I think the frontier is now having a fence, a big, beautiful, tall fence built around it to keep certain people out and to keep certain people in, to keep ideas out and ideas in, content out and content in. And so this concept of frontier, intellectual frontiers and social frontiers that driven our discussion of the web. We talked about the metaphor of cyberspace as the Old West, lawless. We had many metaphors, all of which revolved around the idea of a frontier. And we recognized that as government moved in, the Clinton administration, as government moved in and big business moved in, like the church and the schoolhouse, civilization came and we were closed. After all, what's the first thing the local church did when they moved into the Wild West? They closed the saloon. Well, this is not particularly important other than to say that this has been going on. But I'm going to talk about the digital divide. Why do I really care about this? To go back where I started. Way back when I started, I talked about the railroad track, dividing the good and the bad parts of the city, driving the highway through the city. These things divide. The digital divide this will create is critically important. It's critically important for where we are now and for our future. Now, this is the part where my colleagues at Judith Herb can say I'm wrong. Last study I found 70% of teachers give homework requiring access to the web. Well, if you're poor, Hispanic, Latino, African American, you probably have less access than many other people do. Very hard to do your homework when everyone is zooming along the internet superhighway at 100 megabits per second and you're running at 112K, downloading those photographs. 65% of the students use the internet to complete homework. Well, for those assignments that don't explicitly require access to web, implicitly, if you're going to do well, you need to have access to the web. 50% of students cannot complete a homework due to lack of access to the internet or a computer. A computer many schools have been able to solve. They've been giving out iPads and laptops. Access to the web, as far as I can tell, other than in cities where they have municipal free Wi-Fi, schools have yet to find a solution for homework. Tellingly, 43% of the students stated this lack of access resulted in a lower grade. What does a lower grade mean? It means you're disappointed. You may not work as hard in your next class. A lower grade means you may not have an opportunity to get the honors or the AP classes. A lower grade means you won't be able to serve the college of your choice. This is a snowball. Once the snowball starts, and these things become cumulative, the so-called permanent record can permanently make it difficult for you to achieve your goals and accomplish your dreams. Now, why do I care? Well, first of all, according to the web, I'm a leading cyber libertarian, mainly because I question the role of government. But what does this mean? If we can close the educational gap, our economy over the next, my math is bad here, 35 years or so, would grow $2.3 trillion. The cumulative increase in domestic product between 2014 and 2015 would be $20 trillion, or $551 billion per year. Think of that as one tax cut every 2 years, one super tax cut every 2 years. These are huge sums of money. But we don't care. You should. 1890 is when the frontier was officially closed. The U.S. Census in 1890 closed the frontier, and we have the Turner thesis. So I marked down 1890. If you notice in 1890, the United States and the UK were roughly equal in gross domestic product per capita. You'll notice today, there's a huge difference. That huge difference is accounted for simply. The United States did not necessarily throughout this entire period grow faster than the UK, though often it did. Let's say grow faster in a huge dramatic difference. My understanding when I look at the numbers is the United States continued to grow, but in a small, statistically significant difference. A growth over a long period of time with a small, statistically significant difference results in something we all know and love, particularly those who plan to retire, called, guess what? Come on, you have to tell me. What's the difference in growth? We have this miracle of compound interest. So even if the rest of the world is able to stay just a small, we'll stay just close, but they're ahead of us by a tiny percentage. Over time, there's going to be huge differences. Those huge differences will affect our national economy, our future, our status as a global power, our trading opportunities, our educational opportunities, our investment in research and development, our investment in education, our investment in infrastructure. These things matter. Access to the web, equality of education, equality of access to the web, and the internet superhighway matters. Well, first of all, you should say to me, well, this shouldn't really matter because you're on the web. And everyone knows the only reason you go to the web is to visit your social media account. Is that true? Well, actually, no. Many do. But how about the Khan Academy? 3 years ago, we had the head of the Khan Academy speak here, and the services provide K through 12 and post K through 12 educational opportunities. Multiple open online courses where you can get a college education at little or no cost. Not a degree, but a college education, a practical experience. Open source software and libraries. A student says to me, I can't afford Photoshop. I cannot afford Microsoft Office. Guess what? There's OpenOffice. There are a ton of free shareware policies. In fact, there's 71 major software programs that you will pay hundreds of dollars for that have an open source equivalent that's free and often better. So if you have access to the web, the Creative Commons for content you need, open access for scholarly journals, if you have access to the web, you potentially have access to that education that will close the digital divide. But that access requires something. The access requires that you have broadband, high-speed internet access. These things, even though they're free, must be downloaded, and it takes time. And for those of us who are old enough to remember how slow it used to be, and every time I get a jump, I thought when I was at 24 bars, it's fantastic. And then we went to, 56, then 512. Then I had a T1 line. I currently have, I think, 25 megabits a second, and I am pulling my hair out. When is this thing going to download? And I'm not an impatient 14-year-old trying to do my homework by tomorrow. I'm an impatient law professor trying to get an article out by next year. So, information superhighway, vastly unavailable if there's no net neutrality, but you have to pay the toll now. Be prepared to pay the tolls. I'm going to throughout this talk about tolls in terms of money. The tolls are other things. The tolls can be, you want to have free access, my relationship with Google is wonderful. They give me free services I love. I surrender to Google my personal privacy and my data. And Google promised me they won't share with anyone except their nearest and dearest best friends. So I might have to pay. You might have to pay by saying, yes, I will take this wonderful enhanced access, but you can keep track of my browser history, my search history, my privacy, my information. There are lots of quid pro quos. Payment will be made. It may not be paid in money. It may be paid in time. It may be paid in privacy, personal data, but payment will be made. Let's go to something. I'm not criticizing these companies. The first thing we learned in law school, one of the first things we learned, the principal duty of the board of directors and the corporation is to ensure the profit maximization of the shareholders. That's their job. One of their principal duties is to ensure that I, an investor, do well. They're not running a charity. They're not here to make society better. Those we hope are incidental benefits of the corporate structure and the corporate form, but the primary reason they exist is to maximize shareholder return. If I had this data, and I could sell this data or exploit this data, and I fail to do so, if I'm running a company, I question whether or not I am accomplishing my fiduciary duty to my shareholders. Well, first of all, let's start with people don't actually do this. Even under the light forms of net neutrality they had that wasn't enforceable, Madison River Communication restricted customer access to Vonage. Your ISP, Vonage is basically a free telephone service using the internet, voice over IP, VoIP. Well, Vonage was a competitor. Why don't I use my ability to turn the online pipe to shut down a competitor? AT&T said if you want to use FaceTime, I assume you Apple users all use FaceTime to chat with your friends. You have to buy a special plan. Verizon users found that Netflix and YouTube stream slower than usual. If Netflix, hypothetically, this is not true in this case, if Netflix and YouTube are streaming slower than usual, what am I going to do? I might go to Amazon.com and download my movies on Amazon.com. Again, these are real cases, real examples that happened even under the light concept of net neutrality that existed in the past. Let's do it with a common carrier. It's the obligation of a common carrier to carry without discrimination. You could charge different price. Again, one of my colleagues, when I chatted with him earlier this week, talked about the post office. The post office has lots of different rates. The post office has a book rate. But the post office doesn't ask you the content of the books. It asks you, is it a book? And then you can mail by book rate. I assume they still have the book rate, the library rate. Post office has next day delivery. They don't ask you what you're mailing unless they're worried about the security of the post office. Are you mailing a bomb? Are you mailing something that's hazardous? They simply say, how much does it weigh and when does it have to be there? That is the historical common carrier. They didn't care what you were doing. You fit in a category and they paid. Also, the common carrier did not compete. In other words, the post office was not only ships books from point A to point B, they don't sell books. So the post office had no incentive to use its delivery services to leverage or give themselves an advantage in the book sale service. Now, we talked about, I think it was Verizon versus FCC. Well, what did the FCC do? Being wise, they went back and they simply say, let's reclassify broadband access and make it a common carrier. They published a final rule. DC Court of Appeals upheld the rules, and life was good or bad, depending on your perspective on this issue. We changed administrations. The new administration wants to reconsider and reclassify broadband or dead service providers, so no longer common carriers, and the FCC no longer has the power to enforce net neutrality. Now, I won't go through pros and cons. There are many of them, and I just put a handful of them there. Reasonable minds can differ, and part of it goes back to Hobbes. Some of us hope, and we pray, that we give this technological advantage, opportunities to companies, they will use them to create new services and new opportunities, new investment, spread, make broadband bigger, and make our lives better. Others of us, very cynical, assume that we give these opportunities to companies. They'll use this opportunity to profit maximize, make more money, and not generally share any of the benefits with me. I assume you've all seen the Burger King commercial? Okay, it's a wonderful commercial. Burger King has taken a position on net neutrality. In this commercial, as you notice, you have, I hope you have the right one. You have two properties. You have, I think it's maximum burgers per second. You want to pay $4.99. You want to pay fast burgers at $12.99. If you want a hyper-fast instant Whopper, $25.99. And the question is, what are you willing to pay to get access to content? How much are you willing to wait? Again, for some people, might be willing to wait. I don't know. Like I said, it's a great commercial. This is another example of how these issues are leaving the academy, they're leaving the FCC, and they're hitting the broader community because most of you have a visceral sense of what you think is just and fair in the web. And some of you are quite happy with this. You pay to play. Others are saying this fundamentally violates what I think my social contract is with the internet service provider. Now, not only has this made it in social thing. Recently, Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, who is currently enjoying the hospitality of the Ecuadorian government in London, I understand he has a very nice treadmill, emailed President Trump. He points out to President Trump, your opponents control most internet companies. Without neutrality, they can make your tweets load slowly. CNN can fast load and infest everyone's phones with their ads. Be careful. Be careful. Remember, we have the election. Next election comes cycle. Next political cycle comes out. Next competitors, what is the next vaccine or drug you should take? I can gain an information monopoly by controlling speed. The wonderful thing about the web, there was a saying that freedom of the press belongs to those who own the press. And that was true for a long period of time. You can have freedom of the press, but you don't own the press, you really don't have anything to disseminate or share. The web changed that. The web allowed each of us to be a content provider, a content creator, a publisher, a speaker on the world's largest commons. It also allowed all of us to share this information, understand it, download it. And the web has no curator, it has no authenticity, it has no one there to say what's fake news, what is true news. But it's there for you in this wonderful clash of ideas to decide which side you wish to take a position on. Imagine a world where a handful of companies can clamp down. Instead of everyone having a press, everyone having equal access, a handful of companies will have super access like they do today outside the web, where a handful of companies have FCC licenses for cable or FCC licenses for broadcast. Now, why is this more important now than ever? And by the way, as an IP professor, I hope there's fair use. Let's look at Comcast. Comcast has 24.3 million customers. Notice something. Look what it owns. AT&T, 15 million customers. 15.6, call it 60 million customers. Look what they own. Verizon, look what they own. Now, Yahoo, some of us remember, used to be a search engine. Any of you remember when Yahoo was a search engine? Well, you're Verizon. What do you think they're going to do when I have a choice? I type, hypothetically, none of this has happened yet. Hypothetically, I type on Verizon, www.google.com. What do you think Verizon might do to me? Oh, they'll pop me off to Alta Vista. They'll pop me off to Yahoo. Or I might find it takes a long time to get to Google. Or they'll call Google up and say, by the way, you want to get those customers? Send a check. Or they'll contact me and say, by the way, if you want the super high-speed, net neutral internet service provider, internet service that you've had up until today, your rates have gone up $25. I don't know what the model will be. I do know it's a potential model. And let's go back to Hobbes and Rousseau. You need to decide who you trust. And each of these companies has, if you remember the Burger King ad, those who saw the Burger King ad, why was the Whopper so complicated? Why was ordering the Whopper so difficult? Because Burger King in the ad found out they could make more money selling chicken sandwiches. So Burger King was going to make it difficult to sell a chicken sandwich. Again, go home, watch the ad. Burger King was going to make it very difficult to sell Whoppers, complicated to sell Whoppers, so people will buy chicken sandwiches. These companies can make using this favorite services so complicated, I will be motivated. My internet travels, my fast track on the superhighway will be transformed. I will find myself, if it's a lot easier to get from point A to point B, I will go to the points that they have made easier rather than going to the destinations on the web I find personally superior. Now, the three net neutrality no-nos. Again, this is a non-discrimination clause in the best of all possible worlds. No blocking, no throttling, no trade polarization. Don't block sites. Don't throttle. Don't download content after a period of time so it's harder to get. When I was a law student, there was a restaurant that had all-you-can-eat barbecue wings, buffalo wings. You know, for my size, I found that a really great deal, to be honest with you. Well, the first plate was like 12 or 15 wings, and they were fantastic, spicy but gourmet. The second plate, 10 wings. The third plate, 8 wings. By the time you get to the fourth plate, 4 wings soaked in cayenne pepper with Tabasco sauce. Again, I could have all the wings I can eat, but after the second plate, they made them so unappetizing that I didn't want them. So, prioritization. Throttling. I can give you unlimited access to the web, but some of you find out that after a certain combination, usually on your cell phones, because cell phones or mobile phones are regulated differently, after a certain amount of content, you find out that instead of having 4G, you have 3G, or something else. Your access has gone down. We can do all kinds of things. Yes, you have unlimited access, but understand only the first 2 or 3 movies are going to be really worth seeing. The second 3 or 4 movies are going to take forever to download. Prioritization, pay to play. You can't go until, if you want, tell Google that if you want to be a high-speed search engine, write me a check, and we'll give you prioritization, we'll give you advertising, we will make you first in line. All these things are basic no-nos under any concept of net neutrality. Deep packet inspection I mentioned briefly is wonderful. This is the digital internet electronic frontier high-speed information highway equivalent of the customs agency. As the packets go through, one of the reasons we dreamed and thought there would be net neutrality, we did not realize there would be a technology that allowed me to understand what was passing through. When I wrote my article in 1997, an ISP could only tell where something came from and where it was going to, and not the letter, not what was inside. Think of it as a letter. You can tell who sent it, where it's being mailed to, but you could not tell the contents of the letter. This changed that. Now an ISP can say, motion pictures are going through. Let me detour them one way at a different bandwidth. Oh, they're having certain amount of content we like. Let's detour it another way. Again, selectively prioritize what you want to go through, when you don't want to go through. And I'm not really sure this is a good idea. In fact, I think it's not. Your cyberspace future. This is not a real ad. It was simply on the TV. I liked it. You will subscribe to a basic package of services for $29.95. Now, that'll give you, let's say, a flat rate of bandwidth. You can do anything with that flat rate of bandwidth. But if you want to have that unlimited access or greater access or high-speed access to certain other services, you'll pay more. So this model, if I wanted to have the high-speed access to Google and Blogger and Yahoo and Bing, I pay $5 extra a month. Or if I want to have the shopping package, I pay extra. Again, I have a certain core amount that I will receive at a price. Anything above that, I will pay for. Now, I'm assuming this is like Amazon Prime. People will self-select what packages are best for them. But I also find this, just curious, who do you think the most loathed business, generally the most loathed businesses in the United States are after airlines? It tends to be your cable company. American people generally not happy with their phone companies or their cable company. I'm assuming this will be like my cable company, where I had to buy multiple packages I did not want to get the combinations of channels I wanted. So I assure you, I had no interest in what was essentially a 1970s game show channel where I got to watch Monty Hall do Let's Make a Deal. But that was packaged with some other stuff I wanted. And here, if you're smart, what are you going to do? You're going to take these things and you're going to divide them in such a way. For example, people read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Huffington Post, MSNBC, Fox News, probably want to read all of these. So let's make the Wall Street Journal, let's move it over here to the shopping station. So if I'm a news junkie, I'm going to have to buy shopping to get the Wall Street Journal, and I have to buy my news channel for me to get the rest of the media I want. I'm not really sure that's a good future for us. This model already exists in Portugal. And I'm going to start out with, despite what you read on the web, Portugal has net neutrality. Portugal is a member state of the European Union, and as a member state of the European Union, it must have net neutrality. It does. However, Portugal has been very good or creative at interpreting, adding value-added services. You buy a certain amount of bandwidth, but if you want to buy additional value, you're a social media junkie, and you have to have a lot of social media, but you don't plan on downloading everything else. What Portugal allows me to do is to buy packages. And so this model is not just the dystopian nightmares of law professors and academics and net theorists. The 20 leading theorists of the internet, literally, the men like Berners-Lee who created World Wide Web, by the way, it was not Al Gore, despite what you heard. The men, literally, I'm sorry to say this, it was largely men, there's a few women, who literally are the founding fathers, and since they built the internet, the technology, the infrastructure that makes it possible, wrote a letter to Congress suggesting net neutrality is wrong. is not going to work for the web as they envision it and as the way they understand the technology. Well, the solution. I'm a cyber libertarian, at least I'm told, and I had to have a solution, and the solution is the free market. I don't know how many of you fly, but for those of you who travel frequently, does this represent your experience? No? Yes? Yes. Now, for my benefit, my government has kindly allowed my airlines to be regulated. My airlines, when they started deregulation, then started unbundling services. When the deregulation first started, the legacy airlines said, we would never do things like that. That's for those startups like Southwest, or those smaller airlines like Sprint or something, not Sprint, Spirit, those smaller. We would never do things like that. So we will never do this to our consumers. Well, for those of you who have flown a legacy carrier recently, this is what they're doing to all of us. And they have even created an artificial seat called economy something, in which you get no benefits at all. So basically, for a few dollars less, you don't even get to choose your seat. They give you the last possible seat. So you get all the experiences of traveling on a low-cost carrier with none of the benefits other than saving a few bucks. So I'm not really sure the free market is going to work here, that industries will self-regulate, although I honestly hope that they will. Market discipline. This is where the nice part about being a law professor is we're allowed to step into everyone's disciplines even though we know nothing about it. I'm serious. It's absolutely wonderful. Is that the market discipline usually equals competition. And if there was perfect competition, I would be happy. If there was ease of entry and exit, there was perfect competition, the market would satisfy my need for the internet I and a number of people want because there's a market demand. But the market isn't like that. I would argue it's somewhere between monopolistic and oligarchy. An oligarchy, industry dominated by a small number of large firms. Firms sell either identical or differentiated products, and the industry has significant barriers to entry. Well, for most of our purposes, the web is the web is the web is the web. Access is the same. We care to get on the web. I think most of us we care about the bandwidth, we care about cost, but our access experience is undifferentiated. I could probably switch your internet service provider and you never would notice. I'll talk about a few large firms in a moment. Industry has significant barriers to entry. There are huge, huge fixed costs. Even if you can surmount the fixed costs, there are huge physical costs and difficulties. Imagine the regulatory nightmare of digging up the streets of Toledo to lay new cable. The regulatory nightmare of getting access to telephone poles who are owned by another utility, who, by the way, the utility probably provides internet services. The regulatory nightmare of the easements and the possible permissions you'll need to have access to put your cable in the land, and getting customers not even to deal with the environmental impact. This is a nightmare, so probably it's going to be very difficult if not. There are solutions. Wi-Fi. There are possible solutions out there, and the technology is getting better. But largely, there are significant barriers to entry. At the very least, it's always going to be huge fixed costs. This is the media landscape. I have no idea if any of this is at all legible to people in the audience. But let's look at the first one up here, AT&T. It has a $229 billion market cap. It has 200 million video subscribers and 60 million broadband subscribers. It's wonderful, but what's AT&T buying? Time Warner. If you notice something, Comcast, look at these companies feeding into this. Comcast, Bravo, CSNBC, Universal Studios, DreamWorks. We have a handful of companies. These are the major companies. They are all feeding in. So the degree I want content, whether I like it or not, Comcast is going to control it. And a handful of things. Disney is buying 21st Century Fox. I assume eventually Disney will either take over an ISP, become ISP, or have an ISP or broadband provider take over Disney. And this circle is going to get bigger and bigger and harder and harder. Fewer and fewer players. If you're a small ISP, Dish, Cox, Altus, with a few million subscribers, again, you have a problem here because you have no content. You're licensing content the content is increasingly being owned by the big players. Now again, your small providers, there's still a few small companies out there, maybe one big one. And sometimes they join together with Hulu, where multiple companies have an investment in it. But remember, one of the marks of an oligopoly is there are few competitors. So I'd argue this is relatively few. Now, another way of looking at it is this is what America looks like in terms of internet service providers or broadband providers. There are 12 major providers that cover the 50 states. AT&T has Mississippi, Texas, Cablevision, Montana, Wyoming, Comcast, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Oregon, and keep going. There are a handful, if you notice, there are a handful of significant players. A handful. Again, these are the leading, the dominant in each of these markets. Again, we all know, since we live in Toledo, we have Buckeye Cable, we have some choices up here, but the dominant players. Now, is the United States overflowing with competition? Let's start with the first thing. Notice, if it's a very dark, if it's a very dark blue, it means there is 0 competitors. So, wireline broadband is listed as our traditional cable, and Wi-Fi plus Wi-Fi. So again, if you notice, 25 million people, 26 million people, depending on how you're defining it, have no competitors for the 100 megabits. If you go into what is currently the accepted definition of broadband, which is 25 megabits per second, we have almost 50 million people. And if you take people with 0 or one competitor, if you add 2 competitors, we are now down to over 100 million people. Most of us are experiencing no realistic competitors. And the embarrassing thing about some of the literature, particularly literature dealing with minority peoples, is they'll say they have access to high-speed broadband. They have access to this. And you look at the definition. The definition is they own a cell phone. That cell phone counts as a competitor. I have no idea about your personal lives, but for most of us, the broadband access, the access we have on the cell phone, which usually comes at a significant cost, is not equivalent to the access that we expect when we sit at a desktop or a laptop. They're not comparable. They're not substitutable. They're completely different experiences. Particularly for someone who's doing homework, academic, or serious study, most of us cannot do that on our telephones. Most of us require a much bigger screen and much things. But again, so I basically say here, realistically, in the best of all possible worlds, 16 million people have 3+ competitors. That's what, 330 million Americans? These numbers do not indicate a market where there's robust, ambitious competition. These numbers for broadband services, at least to me, indicate an oligopoly, in some markets bordering on a monopoly. One of the arguments that have been made for why we need to have get rid of net neutrality is because if cable companies and others had additional revenues, because they're now selling a bundle of services that will cost the consumer more, they'll take that money and invest it in bringing broadband to rural America, bringing broadband to the inner city, bringing broadbands from those who have to those who have not. Again, I go back, I'm rather cynical about this. First of all, most of these companies have been using their rather generous profits, the profits I think an economist would call rents, and using these things to do what? To buy other companies, to buy media companies, to buy out their competitors, rather than a substantial investment in expanding the network. Except in areas, for example, where there have been robust expansions is where Google brought in high-speed broadband. There's a handful of cities where Google went in and Google brought in high-speed fiber. In those cities, there's been a dramatic investment. Other cities, not so. And it's even interesting is that you will see discussions on the web where a company will stop the competition 1 or 2 miles away from someone's house. They're asking why. And the answer is, because if you go 2 miles further, there is no competition. I don't need to give special services or high-quality broadband services there because I have no competitors. But I do need to increase my circle big enough to encompass my competition. For those of you who want to know roughly what it costs, to transmit a gigabyte of data is roughly 3 cents. I won't comment more than I'd like you to think about your internet bill. And realize every gigabyte you costs about 3 cents to transmit. If any of you are able to buy a gigabyte of data at 3 cents, will you please let me know? I need a subscription immediately. I'm being very serious about that. I do need a subscription at 3 cents. Now, I acknowledge there's a huge fixed cost. These companies, while they have tiny, relatively marginal costs, the huge fixed costs of establishing the servers, maintaining reliability, putting in the cable, and all those wonderful things are huge fixed costs. But the marginal costs, the profits, once you've paid off the fixed costs, and for many of these companies, the fixed costs have been paid off a generation ago when they were installing huge amounts of fiber optic, indicates there's already a lot of money of profits that can be invested. Some of you are going to say, well, I really don't care about this because the states are going to save me. I have bad news for you, they won't. I wish they would. Why do they say they won't? Well, first of all, states are trying. Some states are trying through the power of the purse. New York is saying, if you don't have net neutrality to an online service provider, and remember, New York has Comcast, New York has some of the biggest players in it, we, the state, will not contract with you. I think that might be a sufficiently big stick to say you're going to lose your New York state contract, or you're going to lose a state contract where at least in that state, if not across their service communities, they will enforce net neutrality. Unfortunately or fortunately, in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Congress gave the FCC the power to preempt these regulations, these rules. I'm not a common law professor. Whether or not a state clearly cannot do it by statute, whether a state could accomplish by power of the purse something it cannot accomplish by statute, I leave to our common law faculty for another day. The second thing, even assuming preemption doesn't apply, I doubt this will work. Many of you, or some of you, have been in cities like San Francisco that have municipal free Wi-Fi, where the city has teamed up with an internet service provider to provide free internet to the community. Some of you have been to airports, you might have to watch an ad or something, but you get free Wi-Fi. And the community has found certain benefits from it, as well as obviously the internet service provider. Well, there's something called regulatory capture, or legislative capture. There are 19 states that have affirmative laws that even if the city or community wanted to create a competitor to a private internet service provider, wanted to cooperate with a competitor to a private internet service provider, they can't. Some of them say they can, but you can only do it in rural areas where there is no competition, and the only possible way of delivering high-speed broadband would be for the city or the community to somehow cooperate with an internet service provider if we're going to have broadband in these rural areas or these underserved areas. But the areas where you'd want to try to stop competition, 19 states say no, you cannot do it. Recommendation. Well, Congress could clarify, look at the decision, Verizon versus FCC, look at the decision and clarify. Congress could say, we really meant to make it clear that the FCC could impose net neutrality rules on information service providers, and if it did so, it would be a gentle hand. And all the baggage that comes with regulating a common carrier would not go to the internet service providers, and maybe internet service providers would be a little less upset. Congress could pass a clean Net Neutrality Act. Period. Just the four principles I said. Congress could pass law. Internet service providers cannot discriminate based on content. It's clean, simple net security law. Not have to worry about all the historical regulatory baggage that comes with it. Finally, Congress could simply say the decision to take internet service providers out of the classification of telecommunications providers and move them back into, or common carriers, and move them back into information service providers was wrong. The FCC should go back to its previous decision. You probably can't see what's happening there, but there's a snowball melting in a warm place. This is my explanation of whether or not any of these things would happen. It's unlikely Congress will take any action. One, because the ideology of the parties currently in control of Congress, and second, regardless of parties, Democrats, Republican, there is a very strong, very vocal group of highly skilled parties on either side of this, and they will fight each other to gridlock. It's unlikely anything will be done. I'd like to thank a few people. I was told I wouldn't have time to thank anyone, so if you could find your name up here, thank you. If you noticed, I did not mention any students by name. I've called and spoke to many of them to express my appreciation for their support, and some of them in the room, some of them have called me. And I would like to say, as a faculty member, one of the happiest days of my career, which are many, is when a student calls me and said, something I learned in your class was useful. Something I learned in your class was useful. You have helped me or prepared me for something I've done in the future. And I can assure you, the degree that law professors have hearts, which some students doubt, that will warm them. Because we never know whether or not we know in theory what we're giving you have value. But it may have value to other students, not to you. But the idea we have given you specifically value is something that's unbelievably heartwarming to all of us. I've had many colleagues over the years, some of whom I'm thanking here have passed away. And to all of them, I'd like to thank them. This has been a great place to have a career at the University of Toledo. I've had outstanding students, outstanding colleagues, and I have no idea what else to say. Thank you all, and do you have any questions for me?
We have time for a couple of questions. Gene Rapp, Carnes have the mics.
Professor Gibbons, it seems highly likely the party in control of the White House will not remain so indefinitely, and that means the head of the FCC will change as well. So, of course, the FCC could change how it approaches its own net neutrality rules. How do you see competitors responding in the market if the FCC doesn't provide a consistent approach? If there's a flip-flop versus net neutrality while the Democrats are in charge, and then it goes to non-net neutrality during the Republicans or something of that sort?
At this time, I think it's supposed to have an aphorism or a quote or something relevant. Years ago, I was told in my first article how MIT decides where to put paths. What you do is you build a building, and you wait and see where students walk, and that's where you put the sidewalk. The problem with Professor Barrett's question is the parties will change, the FCC will change, but there was a very quick turnover between the time the Obama administrative representatives and the FCC imposed this and the change of party. Eventually, the concrete will harden. And it'll become more and more difficult for the FTC to change the rules because contracts will be built in, technology will be built in, and the expectations of the consumer will change. Again, I hope it may change in the future, but it will become more increasingly difficult as time goes on for subsequent administration to reverse net neutrality. It's non-net neutrality. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention open access. Now, okay. You didn't mention open access, and we are talking about open access, publishers going against the open access movement. Do you think that some of these publishers, established publishers, are going to gang up against the open access movement?
Okay, the movement between existing for-profit commercial publishers are already attacking the open access publishers. For those of you who don't know, it's absolutely amazing, for those of you who publish outside of law, is you write an article, or you write a journal article, and you do all the work, you do all the research, and you send it to a publisher, and you have to pay the publisher to publish it. Am I correct, Professor Barrett? And then after you pay the publisher to publish it, if you want to put it on your website, you have to pay them again. it seems really silly to me, is the government has paid me to do the research. I've done the research. The publisher, the journal, has contributed nothing other than putting in paper, and I have to pay for that. The alternative model is open access. They will do the peer review, they'll clean up the article, they'll publish it, and it's mine to share, put up on my website. They charge me a small fee for this, generally less than what I'll pay for a commercial publisher. I can put up my website, I can share it with the world, and it becomes part of the information commons. My problem with the open access system, and this is, if we have pay to play. If you want to push your journal and charge every reader who wants to read your article, again, some of you have done research, and you come up to a journal and says, if you want to download this journal after reading the abstract, please pay us $10, $15, $20, $50. Now, if you're charging $25 or $30 per reader, you can afford pay-to-play. You can afford prioritization. You can afford to make high-speed bandwidth. If you are an open access, not-for-profit journal, you can't. You cannot get your information out there. Right now, if somebody finds it, they can download it. As opposed to if they find it in a few years, they may not be able to find it through blocking. If they can find it, it may not be reasonably feasible. I should, in all conscience, say that I am on the editorial board of a law journal, an open access law journal called Laws, which is published in Switzerland, and so I definitely have taken a position on this through my involvement with them. And by the way, they don't necessarily endorse anything I've said. Thank you. You mean I can actually sit down?
No, you have to come to reception.
Oh, I have to come to reception. Thank you.
So thank you all again for coming. We have a reception in the Shoemaker Loop in Kendrick Lounge. I hope you will join us and you can ask Professor Gibbons more questions there. Please join me in congratulating Professor Gibbons one more time on his installation as Distinguished University Professor.
Congratulations. Thank you very much.